don't even know what I'm had any tea or I think I really do like attend to my person. Oh really? Oh good. I'm so glad. It's done. I'm so excited. That's great. I'm honestly so glad it really took something off my to-do list that had been there for way too long. So I think you've created merit to it yourself. It was good. Yeah, he did great. It was really good. Yeah. He's always like a little bit hard. None of us play the cello, so we have no idea what you're doing. Yeah. Okay. I think I've seen your name in the search. Oh my god, I love it. It's I have two that are both stories. The one today is PhD. And I love that. It's just like incredible. It does make me feel a little weird because I can't reach the time. So it just feels sort of like out of the but which is I think that's fine, but it does feel strange. You know, it sounds like one of those ones that have a different person to be just a lot of yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah. So no, I mean, I'm sure I don't. I just feel like it was like. Yeah. But no, it's not. I'm always nervous before anyone, but. And then for undergrads. It's good. They did just write to me and were like, "We want to increase the cap to 40." You want to double it? Yes. And I was like, "Oh, well." I also like have stuff. Like I have 20 kids. You know what I mean? So I was like, "Oh, let's do this in pairs." Okay, I'm gonna escape. Sorry.
Hello, can you all hear me okay? Yes, everyone can hear me, even people who aren't even at the event. And now, if you aren't in the event, you'd like to join us, feel free, but you probably won't even have to wait, you're all just staring at us. Okay, so, hello everyone, my name is Elspeth Brown, I'm the faculty director for CDHI, which stands for the Critical Digital Humanities Initiative. And I wanted to welcome you to our Visiting Scholar Talk for today. Before we get going, I'd like to make a brief land acknowledgement, but instead I kind of want to make a water acknowledgement, because really it's about the history of the internet, so let's think about the water as opposed to the land. Because waters, of course, is where most cables are for the internet. And here in Toronto, the land and the waters have been and they remain a sacred gathering place for many peoples of Turtle Island, especially the Mississaugas of the Credit. And the Mississaugas have traditionally traveled a great deal by water, including on the Credit River, which has been is known in Ojibwe as Nisanihe, or Trusting Creek. And both the names of the creek as well as the Mississauga comes from the longer history of trade between the Mississaugas and the French. And the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation remains committed, as they have been for generations, to utilizing, protecting, and caring for the waters in a holistic way that promotes continued sustainability. Some of you might know that in 2016, as part of its commitment, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation filed a title claim to waters within their traditional lands, which is 3.9 million acres, which includes Toronto. You may not be surprised to learn that this claim is ongoing. But to learn more about their vibrant community today, please go visit their webpage at MNCFN, stands for Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation.ca. So a few comments around various housekeeping / lawn work. If you are looking for washrooms, there's a single stall university bathroom on the 4th floor. There's multi-stall gender separated bathrooms on the 3rd and 5th floor. We will be live streaming this event because some of the students in my undergraduate class will be listening, and some are here in person. Shout out to you all, thank you for coming. We are not recording the event though, and also please don't take any photographs or recording or social media about the event. I wanted to say a word about CDHI, just to give you a sense of who we are. We emphasize building a digital humanities place that is accessible, anti-racist, decolonial, feminist, and puts queer, trans, non-binary work at its core. We foreground creative praxis, public engagement, and community-based research. We've been around for about 4 years as an ISI, or an institutional strategic initiative, and we have offered fellowships to graduate students, undergraduate students, we've hosted postdocs, we've provided seed funding and other research support to faculty researchers, and we've provided training and DH research tools and methods. We've also hosted a bunch of events like today's. Please go check out our website at dhn.utoronto.ca. And I also want to give a special thanks to the Faculty of Information who is co-sponsoring today's talk. So we are very lucky to be joined today by the brilliant historian Avery Damegriff, who is a lecturer in women, gender, and sexuality studies at Gonzaga University. He founded and served as primary curator of the Queer Digital History Project, which is an independent community history project cataloging and archiving pre-2010 LGBTQ spaces online. He also maintains the Archival Internet Video Index, which indexes video footage of pre-internet and early internet communication platforms. In 2022, he was selected to be a Public Humanities Fellow for Humanities Washington, developing a series of interactive online exhibits, teaching guides, and workshops about the history of LGBTQ+ communities and online spaces. And this year, he's been a member of the Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau. His recent book, which is the focus of our talk today, is for his talk, not really my talk. Really, he's going to be talking. I will stop soon. Anyway, the recent book is called The Two Revolutions. I'll do a Vanna Wright, A History of the Transgender Internet, NYU Press, 2023. And it tracks how the internet transformed transgender political organizing from the 80s to the contemporary moment. And also, I wanted to let you know that the book is available for sale. I do encourage you to buy it. We've got a discount code flyer here. You're welcome to grab one. When I read Avery's book last year, I was really blown away by his careful research and excellent writing and persuasive argumentation. And as a historian who doesn't usually work with born digital primary sources, although I kind of make them often with my oral history work, I saw in Avery Scholarship a really incredible model of doing careful historical research with a type of primary source, which is to say born digital records, that is really pretty much unfamiliar to most traditional historians, which I'm not sure I'm why, but I am in the history department. Anyway, as Avery shows so brilliantly, one can't write a history of the late 20th century and later without an engagement with the digital past. And this is old news, of course, to scholars in information studies and media studies and other fields, but it's really new terrain for historians. And so I feel very strongly that we have a lot to learn from his amazing work, not only in terms of methods, which I've emphasized here, but especially now, post-January 20th, in content. And I hope you will agree. So please join me in welcoming Avery.
First off, thank you for that wonderful introduction and for everyone who's been so welcoming throughout the entire day. 2 notes. A, this talk is a different ending. It used to have a different ending. And I finished writing it 5 minutes before I came, so I appreciate your generosity. We're trial running this. It was based on recent events. So it was like, I feel like I need a new ending. Other thing is, in a couple minutes, I'm going to make you talk to me for a hot second. So there will be some minor audience interaction. All right. So I always say, like, I begin this talk with. So when I grew up, there were always 2 computers in our house. There's one for my father, which he used for his jobs as a systems administrator. He ran servers, basically. And I got his hand-me-downs. You can see a photo from 1995 here. This is not exactly a top-of-the-line computer for the period, but for a 7-year-old, this is a pretty nice setup. And so because of the nature of my father's job, we had internet, home internet, well before a lot of my other peers. So I have this memories of us sitting side by side on weekend nights. He is working through some issue for a server for work, and I am chatting with strangers online. However, the thing about these narratives is that they're also very generational. So, like I said, I'm going to make you talk to me for a second. I'm curious, what are folks' early memories of using computers and the internet? Go for it, shout it out. I can't give you a mic though.
On.
What?
On.
I feel like that is a lot of people's memories. You're awakening by the internet.
ICQ.
ICQ. Got some AIM probably happening here.
MSN.
Was it Messenger with friends? So you kept up with people. If it was AIM, you had your away message that meant so much and the font and colors you chose.
I remember the Apple IIgs.
Was there a favorite game?
I can't remember the early games, but I'm sure by the time Oregon Trail came on, I was obsessed. But that would have been a little later than the Apple IIgs, I think. So.
Dial-up ringtone.
I was gonna say, I wait for someone to mention that.
Yeah.
My favorite anecdote about this is to explain my research. I play that for my students. I'm like, you can describe my research in a sound, and I play it. And one time I did that, I had this 19-year-old kid, and I specifically mentioned, say, to get a sense of the experience, this kid was a football player, so he's a pretty big kid, leaps out of his seat like he has sat on a snake, curls in and is like, what is that? Like, that was the internet 20 years ago. And so I usually, I start with these particular memories, because we all sort of have them. Sometimes, depending on the age of my audience, Neopets will come up, indoor Webkins. If we go further back, this may go into like early email. Like we get a bunch of different kinds of narratives about this. And I say that these memories, I ask for them, is they stick with us. They tell us something about ourselves, what we remember about our experiences. And like for me, this was a deeply personal revelation. So if you used enough early text chat, and these would be anonymous online chat rooms, you became used to answering the same question over and over, ASL for age, sex, location. Now we probably say like AGL, age, gender, location. So in my moment of doing this over and over in these chat rooms with strangers, I had this realization, I could lie about this. I never lied outright because I was very much a rule follower. I am not rebellious. But the ability to lie by omission about my gender is this practice I would engage in repeatedly throughout my early years online. I would want people to just sort of assume I was male and not ask too many questions. And so looking back, this practice really fit for me within my larger trans experience. Because when I came out in late 2006, I didn't know any trans people in my daily life. I notably came out while I was an undergraduate at the University of Alabama, Tuscaloosa. Instead, I was connecting through trans-specific groups online, and I relied on digital guides to find resources. So my experience is just one specific anecdotal example, but it represents some of the ways trans folks benefited from digital communications. And though I didn't know it at the time, trans individuals had been communicating via computers since the early 1980s, long before I was, again, chatting with strangers. And as I argue in the book, the contemporary trans movement just can't exist without the internet. To go into more detail, though, in the two revolutions, I explore the historical forces that made the trans movement possible, as well as how trans individuals fit within the broader history of digital communications. So in this talk, I'll be focusing on tracing two major threads that wind through the book. It's two revolutions, so to speak. The emergence of transgender as a shared political and community identity, and the family computer and the rise of the internet. So I'm going to start this out by talking about language change over time within trans communities, though, to provide a bit of historical context for how transgender spread through the specific platforms and moments I'll discuss later. So, in the mid-1980s when the book begins, the most common term for trans folks was the gender community. It's primarily made up of two groups: heterosexual crossdressers who had an emotional and/or erotic interest in performing femininity through dress and self-presentation, and transsexual individuals who sought to socially and medically transition from their sex assigned at birth. It's important to note that while trans men are absolutely around and beginning to organize throughout this entire time, their presence within community publications and the archive and online, as far as we know, was dwarfed by trans women. So among these folks are also transgenderists, like Virginia Prince, who did take HRT, but didn't desire any other medical interventions, and androgynous folks like Ariadne Kane. However, anyone who wasn't a transsexual is effectively sort of placed under the crossdresser umbrella. So these two groups had at times really uneasy alignments. They're unified by their similar cross-gender interests and desires, but they're also uncomfortable with the implied associations of this alliance. First, for some heterosexual crossdressers, particularly married ones, they feared that proximity to transsexuals might make their spouses worry that they really wanted to transition. And some of them eventually did. But it was more about this perception that cross-dressing is automatically a first step toward transition. Second, transsexuals worry that associating with cross-dressers who didn't have the sort of stable cross-sex identification might diminish their chances of passing, make them seem like they were playing at their identity. So we have all this happening. But by the late 1980s, there's increasing interest within the community in creating an apparatus for large-scale political organizing. However, community members also realize that while gender's vagueness renders it functional as a community name, it's really politically unpersuasive. You're not going to stick it on, like, billboards or on bumper stickers. Thus launches the ongoing search for a new collective term for the community. Several different ones are proposed, including by gender role, by Virginia Prince, or conscious gender community by Ariadne Kane. Ultimately, though, repurposing transgender as an umbrella term. Early on, you often see in the adjectival form transgendered, it finds the most early advocates, who they highlight transgender's expansive possibilities. Compared to gender community, transgender clearly signals individuals' shared cross-gender affinity and experiences with oppression, but also decenters the power of medical authority to sort trans experience into one of two diagnostic buckets. However, proposing this term is just a first step. The real challenge is actually encouraging widespread adoption. This is where digital communications, and eventually the internet, come into play. So before we get to adoption, though, we actually have to talk about how do trans folks get online in the first place. So it's important to note in the mid-1980s, folks had a very different relationship with computers than we do now. Though personal computers, what were then known as microcomputers, were becoming more common, they were by no means ubiquitous. So the popular image of the computer is probably best represented by the 1983 film War Games, which is that screenshot up there on the left. Depending on how old you are, you recognize this screenshot down there on the right. And so in War Games, a computer is a technical tool. It's used for business and bureaucracy, but it's also the realm of hackers and geeks. And notably during this period, there were several different ways folks could communicate. So most visible commercial services were things like CompuServe, Prodigy, Q-Link, which would go on to become American Online, or General Electric's Genie. I should pause here to note, a lot of this is going to be very American, so some of these services would also vary based on place. So it's just to say, like, this early context of commercial services largely is going to be American history. So these are all what's called walled gardens. They offer a lot of services, but they limit users' access to other outside networks. The meta ecosystem, so Facebook, Instagram, and Threads, we can think of this as a contemporary example of a walled garden. And while there were trans spaces on all of these services, we know a lot less about them than we do their scrappier independent alternatives, the bulletin board system, or BBS. So this is a photo of a BBS here. As you can tell, it's just, we got one microcomputer, we got a modem, we got some associated equipment like external hard drives, but that is pretty much it. BBSs are some of the first publicly available ways folks communicated via modem. So this graphic has floated around the internet for God knows how long. I have no idea who made it, and it is a perfect explanation. So basically, you've got your computer, you use your modem, you dial the BBS's phone number through your phone line, it calls that other phone. If there's a line available, it picks up, and then you can log in to the BBS. At their core, the BBS is basically just a server, and it has lots of different functions. You can chat, you can send and receive email, you can access the files they host. Basically, a lot of it's like the very first form of social media. And so on January 1st in 1984, the first BBS for the gender community, GenderNet, goes live. By 85, GenderNet's sponsoring organization, the Gateway Gender Alliance, proudly claimed to have, quote, more calls than we ever anticipated, 402 within a 15-day period. So also I'll pause here. The image on the slide that will come up next does include some nudity. I have sort of tastefully censored it, and I'll explain a bit about the context of why I'm including it. But just as a heads up, if anyone on the stream, that will be coming up here in the room. So one of GenderNet's first callers was journalist Robert E. Carr, who included the BBS in his March 1985 Playboy article, Type Dirty to Me. I just love this cat. This is a mystifying cat in the right corner. All right, so in this article, Carr expresses surprise at, quote, witnessing an incredible statistic. Multiple transsexuals in one place. To Carr, GenderNet presented an irresistible opportunity. After all, he notes, how many transsexuals do you know who own computers? 1, 2, 3 at the most, right? Based on the GGA's number, however, there were certainly a lot more than 3. While GenderNet doesn't last past 1986, when the Gateway Gender Alliance dissolved, its success became proof of concept for a variety of folks within the gender community. So throughout the late 80s, more BBSs specifically targeted at the community would launch, and I've listed some of them here. And then listings for these BBSs began to appear regularly in Tapestry, the major publication for the gender community for much of the magazine's life, in the Directory of Organizations and Services as early as '87, and they get from the section by 1990. So regular BBS users were quick to recognize the format's potential. So writing in the inaugural '91 issue of Chrysalis Quarterly, author Stephanie Rose noted that, quote, the gender community was in the midst of two revolutions. That may be where the title came from. The, quote, overdevelopment of a shared political consciousness and the covert, quote, computer revolution, from which they stood to gain more from than any other social groups out there. Finding and talking to others like ourselves gives us strength, Rose argued. We feel more comfortable and we know we are not alone. The message sections of BBSs give us that sense of community. And politically minded community members heartily embrace this technology. So the Sunday Society was one of the earliest organizations to really promote the BBS as a political tool. So they were founded in '88 as an offshoot of the existing Chicago Gender Society, specifically focused on transsexuals. And so their first big project was the United Sisterhood of Transsexual Outreach Organizations, or US2 network. They initially conceived of it as like a bunch of interconnected microcomputers, but that proved very complicated. So they basically transitioned it to a BBS by 1989. So in their inaugural newsletter, an unnamed author, it's likely one of the group's two founders, they present US2 as a way to overcome existing technology's limitations and unite users as part of a larger movement. As they argue, compared to the existing grapevine, where information and support is spread unevenly amongst its many branches, a computer network was far more sustainable as a distribution system, as information can quickly and evenly be spread amongst its many nodes. So in ads like this that ran other newsletters where the Sunday Society promoted US2, they really urged folks to imagine this future where, quote, they were all uniting ourselves in one of the most important causes in our lives. And then in October 1989 column, Sunday Society co-founder Louisa Rader leans heavily on the sort of techno-utopian rhetoric to emphasize US2's revolutionary possibilities, and also really encourage her readers to get involved. She compares US2 to launching a Saturn V rocket that that moment when, quote, science fiction became science fact and fantasy became reality. Through the hard work of, quote, many years of planning, experimenting, and testing by sincerely dedicated individuals. You can hear that, like, James Horner score coming up in the background right now behind this quote. Now, some 20 years later, a new mission is underway. And like the Apollo program, launching US2 would be an equally difficult, rewarding endeavor. I don't really have good trailer guy voice, unfortunately. US2, according to her, was this opportunity to not only, quote, solve one of our greatest obstacles, the communication gap within our community, but also, quote, make history and forever change the way our community is considered by others. In this column, she ends with a challenge to her readers. Whether we have a smooth liftoff or blow up on the pad will be up to all of us. All systems are go on this end. How about you? Though it's unclear how successful US2 actually was, her rhetoric really invites her readers to imagine this radically different potential future, where computer communication inaugurates new imaginative possibilities, including a visible, politically active community. Yet even as folks like Rose and Rader argued for their radical political potential, the number of actual BBS users made up a relatively small portion of the wider gender community. Non-technical community members presented BBSing as a, quote, technical endeavor for the computer literate who knew the lingo, or in one evocative turn of phrase, the hackers in our community. They were not hackers, it's just if you knew how to use a computer, they called you a hacker. As with the rest of America, however, the computer illiterate of the gender community, that was what they called themselves, would ride the .com bubble to a place branding itself as the internet and a whole lot more. America. But for all these folks to get online, they first need to get a computer. There we go. So within the United States, home computer sales, particularly for those households who never owned a computer before, grew rapidly throughout the mid-1990s, as we can see in these stats from the Census Bureau. So during the period, the computer was shifting from being seen again as this totally technical tool for white-collar work, sort of the stuff we talk about with war games, into something more like a domestic appliance. So in 1994, a National Telecommunications and Information Administration survey found 50% of households making at least $50,000 USD, roughly $108,000 in 2024, had a computer and modem at home. And that figure jumped to 60% by 1997. So you can see some of this growth depicted here in these charts from a 1998 NTIA report. Notably, both race and economic class were key factors in early computer adoption rates. From this, we can intuit early on, access was limited to mostly white, middle, and upper class homes. And this increasing demand for PCs also drove the growing direct-to-consumer market, led by Dell and Gateway, with its iconic Cowprint branded boxes. So instead of focusing on technical specs, these companies really framed the PC as a customizable appliance that you could purchase outright, or similar to, again, a comparable home appliance or furniture purchase, was financed through the company and paid off in monthly installments. We don't really have good stats on how many folks use this installment approach, but it's likely the very fact it could pay off in smaller amounts opened up computer ownership to those who might not have otherwise been able to afford it. And so by 1998, a Pew study had found that 41% of all adult respondents were using the internet, up from 36% in 1997 and 23% in 1996. So this change marks the beginning of the era of the family computer, which was usually located in a shared space, like a living room or a family room, where different family members could access it when they needed it. And Clinton-era rhetoric really reinforced this idea that computers and resources of the information superhighway were essential for young Americans' future success. So we can see these themes reproduced in these mid-90s ads for the Macintosh Performa, which Apple specifically sold not through specialty or electronic stores, but at mass market retailers like Sears. Also, this sudden interest in computing was accompanied by a network fever that overtook popular media. Films from this era, such as The Net, Hackers, and others, presented audiences with a highly visual and stylized vision of the possibilities of the new, quote-unquote, electronic frontier. Again, it's the 90s, there are skateboards and floppies. And these early majority adopters, who were not amongst the hackers of the community, so to speak, were more likely to first get wired using a major service provider, like the ones I listed earlier. So trans individuals had presences on all of these platforms, each with their user culture, norms, and access restrictions. Both the Genie area and gender line on CompuServe required special permission to join, while the trans chat room on AOL was for many years a transient space, forced to close and reopen based on moderators' whims. I'll talk about that in just a second. Yet all of these spaces' existence was contingent on the continued goodwill of their corporate hosts. The presence of such possibly adult material appeared to some to contradict platforms' family-friendly images, as seen in this clip will not have sound. So, this 1996 AOL commercial emphasizing the service's kid-friendly aspects. As you can see, a bunch of peppy middle-class children are getting homework help. They're learning about dinosaurs. They're even gonna, in a second, get to email the president. So part of this imagery choice was also likely spurred on by the cyber porn panic of the mid-1990s. So during this period, American news media were filled with stories such as this infamous July 95 Time cover piece discussing the danger this novel new medium posed to young children. Many authors use anecdotal stories to highlight the internet's risks. So in this timepiece, for example, author Philip Elbert DeWitt cites the experience of 10-year-old Anders Ermacher, who was emailed a file filled with photos of, quote, this is from the article, couples engaged in various acts of sodomy, heterosexual intercourse, and lesbian sex. I guess Anders got a new awakening. All right, most often though, these stories really emphasize the child subject's innocence. This quote over here on the left is from Ermacher's mother, and Elmer DeWitt makes a point to note that Ermacher was a frequent presence in AOL's kid-specific Treehouse chapter. So I'll note some of these themes may sound very present and familiar to our current moment. So in this kind of environment, trans individuals' wider associations with pornography made them vulnerable to efforts challenging the right to convene in public online. So we see this especially, this is a widely syndicated 1993 Washington Post column. And it's got all of the generic, in terms of genre, hallmarks of this kind of cyber porn panic story. You've got an innocent child, a pornographic topic, transvestites, and this evocative stinger quote from Genevieve Kasdan. She was thinking in all innocence, we're going to talk about Barney. So this introduction serves for the author of this column as an example of how users were now exposed to, quote, some of the raunchier aspects of human life. As a side note, I have an 8-year-old. My 8-year-old would not be watching Barney. I'd say, like, no 8-year-old kid wants to watch Barney in 1993. Anyway, absent, of course, from this story is the voice of the transvestites active within TV Chat, which is a well-known trans support chat room at the time. For while authors no doubt imagined that these were spaces that were like salacious dens of iniquity, they were more akin to a sport group or social club. In fact, trans users in trans spaces implicitly or explicitly discourage public discussion of adult topics. This informal ban had been part of a larger push going on for many years by trans organizations and cross-dressing organizations in particular to gain mainstream respectability. Of course, these moves had no impact on AOL's terms of service, though, which for many years maintained that both transsexual and transvestite, as well as the acronym TS, were vulgar language that when used in, quote, email, chat, message boards, or instant messages, violated AOL's terms of service. And in fact, this meant that the very mention of trans and trans-adjacent topics could lead to a permanent ban from AOL. As a result, the first trans chat room on AOL, which began in 1991, was coded as a gender discussion. It was held in small private rooms capped at 24 people. However, within the first year, the room was regularly at capacity. They would eventually arrange to use the Gay and Lesbian Community Forum, or GLCF. They had a larger chat room, and so they arranged that they would use that once a week to meet. Even so, because the GLCF's room was public, it did mean that users could no longer use that vulgar language without fearing possible censure from roving AOL moderators. So a lot of members continued to use gender as this umbrella stand-up. Ultimately, AOL's terms of service were, according to AOL regular Gwendolyn Smith, who will show up again in just a second, they were a form of erasure and delegitimizing, as if to say the only reason one would need to talk about trans issues was a sexually deviant reason. We were not seen as humans who simply wanted to come together to discuss our interests, no matter how mundane they might be. So following a particularly aggressive campaign to close trans-related chat rooms in late 93 and early 94, users began a concerted letter and email writing campaign to protest the policy. The letter campaign is a distinct change in tactics for trans AOL users. Though both groups were nominally part of the gender community, transsexual and cross-dressing users' differing needs represent a major hurdle to successful cooperation. Yet the non-specificity of TOF terms of service enforcement meant that all these users are targeted equally, and their shared discrimination necessitated this united front. So campaigners also called on allies, such as the leadership of the GLCF, to get involved as well. However, trans AOL community leaders' increasing association with gay and lesbian organizations didn't sit well with some heterosexual crossdressers, who strongly opposed any connection with them for fear it would mark them as gay. And they initially opposed even just using the GLCF's conference room. So trans leadership, in contrast, saw the GLCF's identity collective model, which was new to the community, in terms of like the trans community, as one they could emulate for their own cause. So this is from an undated letter published while the campaign was ongoing. The moderator of the gender chat on AOL at the time, Melanie Ann Phillips, she argued that gay and lesbian users use their, quote, niche as a base to grow and lobby for a home of their own, once they were, quote, a large enough force online. With our history of growth on AOL as a community, it seemed to her the best way to accomplish getting acceptance in our own forum is to keep adding services for our increasing membership until we, too, are a force big enough to be recognized. So Phillips closes this letter urging, quote, everyone in the gender community to spend at least some of their online time here, thereby contributing to our political clout and ultimately a forum of our own. This call to spend time here was, in essence, a request for trans users to put their money back into trans-oriented services. And this is all about the way that AOL charges to use the service prior to 1996. So, at this time, AOL users are charged hourly fees in different forums, which were all notably run by independent subcontractors of AOL. They were not owned by AOL, many of them. They were granted increased space and support based on their churn rate, or how many users visited and how long they stayed online at that specific forum or chat room. So basically, you get your free however many hours, and then for each hour, depending on what time it was either $2.95 or I think it at one point went to $3.95. So you're paying per hour. The longer you stay, the more you're paying. So by spending their time in the trans areas of the GLCF, as they were added, trans users would show they were a low churning population. So they're not leaving very often. And that's worth investing in. As such, Phillips was asking these users to see themselves as a collective consumer bloc whose spending habits could push AOL to reconsider their position on trans individuals' presence on the service. So the users launch this campaign, they send tons of emails, lots of stuff happens. AOL offers zero official response. It's basically radio silence for many of them. Until mid-94, when letter writers receive a mass mailed email notifying them that transgender discussions were now allowed, quote, as long as they conform to terms of service. So as Phillips predicted, trans users' presence following this policy change grows rapidly throughout 94 into 95, when the official Transgender Community Forum, or TCF, opened within the Gay and Lesbian Community Forum, overseen by Wendell and Ann Smith. So obviously, these screenshots I have are all provided by Smith. And by this time, Phillips had basically pulled back from any kind of trans organizing. So this choice to use transgender instead of gender reflects the shift in political winds within the community, where transgender is steadily picking up steam as the community's public-facing identity, not unlike the gay and lesbian groups Phillips pointed to for inspiration. So we see the term increasingly being used by major community organizations, most notably Tapestry. They changed their name at the same time as the TCF is launched. As the term's visibility grows, it becomes the default identity, the way you find others like you online. So in this 1997 article on the TCF that appeared in GLAAD's Media Images magazine, you see in the story, the eponymous jokesters highlights the term's importance. As you see in the quote at the bottom, she was able to almost immediately connect to her community through having the word transgender. So by the early 2000s, transgender is almost universally adopted by all the major community organizations. And soon we've got a new portion of the population who otherwise had rarely been seen or using the term to self-identify, trans youth. So as the tale of the TCF illustrates, the presence of youth online raised a variety of challenging questions for the community. Though I don't have good statistics on minors' computer use during this period, what we do know from Pew surveys is that 70% of 18 to 29-year-olds that they surveyed in 97 said they were regular internet users. By 2005, this number has increased to 83%. And some of these youth are trans. So the rise of trans youth as a recognizable demographic is this major change for a community that had long been very hesitant to interact with legal minors. For example, prominent trans publisher Kimberly Richards wrote in a 1994 column that she felt uncomfortable just doing informal phone counseling with youth without a referring doctor or nurse on the line, lest the call become, quote, a potentially dangerous situation should the teen's parents feel she was, again, quoting from her, contributing to the delinquency of a minor and would call the police. In the end, Richards concluded that she, quote, honestly didn't know if there was anything transgender organizations could do for youth. And she admitted she wouldn't sleep well with that admission. And even though she was really worried about the teens that she'd spoken to on the phone, she hoped a new technology that she herself often championed might provide an important source of support, the internet. Because while Richards was writing about all this in 1994, trans youth had been present in digital trans spaces since 1988. So on the Trans-Pacific CD Forum email mailing list, trans youth, many of whom first get connected when they go to university, were able to ask questions and learn how to safely explore their cross-gender feelings, find supportive therapists, and grow their networks. However, most of the people trans youth were talking to on CD Forum were trans adults. Furthermore, the pool of youth with net access is relatively limited at this time. If you were writing to CD Forum, you're already a computer hobbyist, so more a nerd, or you're technically inclined. So for a lot of these posters who are saying, like, I just got access because I went to college, almost universally, their introductions are like, I'm an engineering major, I'm a computer science major. That's someone who's already connected to this stuff. So for trans youth who were born in the mid to late 1980s, of which I am one, I'm a dreaded millennial, they likely grew up around personal computers, either at home or at school, or both. For them, the internet seemed like an obvious information source and social outlet, as we can see from this 2001 article on trans youth from the Advocate. Speaking of things that got mentioned, they connected through a variety of resources, from IRC chats and instant messenger to small-scale message boards. However, many of these formats are relatively ephemeral, and they leave behind few archival traces. Only one format was extensively archived, the homepage. So during the late 1990s to early 2000s, ad-supported web hosting services like GeoCities allowed users to create their own websites or homepages that featured a variety of personalized content, from hobbies and fandoms to photo collections and journals. So compared to a text-heavy email list, a homepage felt vibrant. A lot of creators decorated their spaces like you might your bedroom. You have an array of colors, typefaces, dreaded embedded music files, animated GIFs everywhere. This is just a couple of examples. I did not animate them for your sanity. Effectively, we can think of the homepage as this early precursor to the social media profile. And homepage owners could connect through web links or directories, which link sites together through their shared membership. So the most extensively archived of these is the Transgendered Teens web directory. It was created in 1998, and the last archive we have of it is in 2002. It includes links, homepages, and email addresses for youth members from 32 different states and 8 other countries. So these homepages had a bunch of different information, from advice on coming out and navigating being out in high school, to pursuing medical transition as a teen. For example, the founder of the directory, Sarah, her diary, which ran from 1997 to 2001, includes repeated references to her ongoing email communication with a variety of other trans teens who help her navigate her self-identity, coming out to her parents, and building connections with a community. Some of them use their homepages to share their coming out letters to their parents, or in one case, as the primary venue for coming out. So Sarah puts her coming out letter on her homepage, but she also changed the landing page for the browser on her home computer to her coming out letter. Which means that her parents, who, as she says, know nothing about computers, every time they try to go on the internet, they have to read her coming out letter. Which, to fix it, they have to talk to her about it. Alternatively, some of these folks were outed by their homepages. So 14-year-old Jennifer describes how after her mom walked in on her and read her homepage as she slept, was now under, quote, martial law. So at the bottom of her page, she has this addendum, I've highlighted here, Mom, if you're reading this, let me be who I want to be. I'll note with this page, we don't have a visual version of the archive, I'm unclear why, unfortunately. Several teens who were outed by their pages reported having their computer and internet access severely restricted. This reminder of their limited autonomy in the era of the shared family computer, which was for many the primary way they accessed the internet. Trans youth also recognized their site's impact on readers, and many made a point to note their sites were by teens for teens. For creator Dylan Matthew, one of the key inspirations in his home pages was his belief that, quote, it's important for other trans kids to be able to run across people like themselves, which inspired him to try to produce the sort of thing I fancy stumbling upon. I'm also keeping up these pages because I think it helps a person to share some of himself with the world, even if it's only via the internet. So reading this quote now, when platforms incentivize sharing as just another mode of monetization, its core sentiment can seem a bit quaint. But given how otherwise invisible trans youth were in public life at this time, being able to see homepages by and for other use represents a revolutionary change. Unlike Richard's tenuous phone calls, parental consent and approval weren't always a prerequisite for talking to other trans folks online. In fact, as the example from Jennifer's page highlight, some youth continue to embrace a trans identity despite parental disapproval. And for youth who didn't live in metro centers with established LGBTQ youth groups, these pages and the connections they enabled were a lifeline. The speed and reach of digital communications allowed youth all over the country, and in some cases all over the world, as long as they spoke English, to develop a specific and shared identity, not just as teens who happen to be trans, but a growing demographic subset of the wider trans community. Through these online spaces, what had once seemed really rare, publicly identifying as trans before you get into your 30s, was rapidly becoming a common shared experience for many. So to bring this back to where I started, these youth had always identified as transgender. The internet so effectively and rapidly spread the term, they likely never knew anything different existed. Moreover, many of them understood transgender as both a personal but also a political identity, part of what we now call the LGBTQ umbrella. So now, youth are more likely than ever to identify as transgender, as you can see from these stats within the US, from the UCLA's Williams Institute. Yet, at the current moment, they repeatedly encounter rhetoric deeming their self-identity a fad, the result of social contagion, or a case of rapid onset gender dysphoria. I can't say that seriously, sorry. Within the United States, they face an onslaught of legislation that is attempting to write them out of existence. And the one place where they find each other, social media, can vacillate between either monitoring their content out of existence or refusing to protect them altogether. Within the United States, compounding this risk are bills like the Kids Online Safety Act, or KOSA, whose duty of care provision could be used by the Federal Trade Commission to deliberately prevent access to LGBTQ content for users under 18. We've also seen, referencing our last slide, just how platforms have begun to preemptively block access just in case. So all of these trends together strip these folks of their agency and tell them you should not exist. You cannot exist. So now what? This is the new part. So I used to end this talk with a teaching anecdote about the importance of trans history as a resource for trans youth. It was a chance to draw strength from knowledge of their transcestors, to borrow a term from trans studies scholar Hill Malatino. And it's a good story. It makes people smile. I'm happy to tell you about it in the Q&A. But in our current moment, I've come to think that just knowing history will not be enough. I never intended to be someone who did timely work, but there's no way around it. As this book and my work with the Queer Digital History Project illustrates, digital queer existence has been precarious since the inception of computer communication. LGBTQ users and their discussions were only tentatively embraced by commercial platforms once they were understood as a possible source of revenue. Currently, queer and trans people's initial usefulness is defined by the depth of our pocketbooks and our appeal as a targeted ad market. Once that's expended, we become a kind of industrial byproduct that platforms can repurpose as raw material for creating their main product, user engagement. And like all byproducts, its revenue potential pales in comparison to the main product. Some, like Meta Chief Marketing Officer Alex Schultz, also engaged with him, would say we should see this repurposing, a return to familiar cultural roles, as rejected deviants and pitiable victims, as an opportunity. And I suspect many of you in this audience, don't agree with Schultz. Given how much of queer and trans life is, for better or worse, online, I'd argue it is increasingly an unlivable life. As Judith Butler argues in Undoing Gender, quote, when we ask what makes a life livable, we are asking about certain normative conditions that must be fulfilled to become life. And as they note, it's not just about fulfillable conditions, but also how we are politically conceptualizing the possibility of the livable life and arranging for its institutional support. I'm just going to pause to note, I wrote a whole book about trans people, and I didn't cite Judith Butler once, but my time has come, unfortunately. It's a really good quote. Revisiting this book, it's a really good book. So I would argue that the history of the trans internet is also about conceptualizing possibility and creating institutional support. Trans individuals use digital media communication tools to conceptualize what it meant to live life as a trans person, increasingly from a relatively young age, using self-created and community-owned media institutions, newsletters, bulletin board systems, mailing lists, homepages. In contrast, ad-supported social media, be it owned by Meta, ByteDance, or any of other number of companies, simply cannot provide the necessary institutional support. In fact, I'd go so far as to say it's against their fundamental nature. So I see this in this anecdote Gwen Smith has shared with me and she's written about before. So in 1997, or late 96, corporate AOL staff visited the offices of OnQ, who again were the independent subcontractor that owned and ran the GLCF and the TCF. And they specifically requested to meet with her. The TCF, according to them, was one of the most successful forums on AOL in terms of user retention, at a time when AOL overall was hemorrhaging users to the World Wide Web. AOL corporate wanted to know her secret, in case it was something they could replicate elsewhere. But there was no secret or trick, Smith told them. It was just that TCF users were a population desperately in need of support, and at the TCF they found community. In this story, AOL valued these users for their revenue-generating potential. Smith, in contrast, valued these users as members of a community they collectively nurtured together for over the past few years. For even though the TCF was on AOL, AOL didn't own the TCF or its parent company, OnQ. OnQ, again, was a subcontractor to AOL for their hosting, making it fundamentally still a form of community-owned media. And it would be a contract dispute that would lead to them leaving AOL. And so throughout all these histories, ownership is the one unifying thread. So in the book's conclusion, I quote one of the rallying cries behind the founding of the famed community nonprofit, the Organization for Transformative Works, who runs the archive of our own. I want us to own the goddamn servers. At a moment when political forces conspire to make trans lives unlivable, such safe digital fora will be one key institutional support amongst many. Having a real, meaningful stake in ownership, to have us own the goddamn servers, enables LGBTQ individuals to assume responsibility for our collective future in all of its messy incompleteness. I can't promise that this is easy to do, especially since what could replace our contemporary platforms is unclear. All of our alternatives they're new and we're figuring it out. But when I think about it, I'm reminded of the ending of Ursula K. Le Guin's The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelos. And Omelos is a city whose eternal happiness relies on the complete exploitation of one sole child. And I will read this quote because Le Guin is amazing. They leave Omelos, they walk ahead into the darkness, and they do not come back. The place they go towards is a place even less imaginable to most of us than the city of happiness. I cannot describe it at all. It is possible that it does not exist, but they seem to know where they are going, the ones who walk away from Omelos. In a way, I would say Omelos is like our contemporary environment. It's a simulacrum of the real world, where individual agency and happiness are possible only because the hard work is eternally someone else's responsibility. Walking away is hard. The feelings of sunk costs are real, and there's no complete perfect break. We will always be messily entangled in this stuff. But we can choose to start walking away, to help conceptualize the political possibility of a digital place where all lives are livable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Avery. That was wonderful. We have plenty of time for questions, and I'm wondering if anyone would like to start us off with a question for our speaker. Oh, Chris.
So I have so many I'm transitory. So I have so many nerdy history questions for you.
What about that?
I'm gonna sort of zoom out. So I know that there's one trans woman and more here that sort of creates websites, works in web design, and I know Wider Eye School also works with a lot of information stuff. So what's the next step, right? With your call to action, do you have any tangible things that the audience can take away from this?
I think this is why I sort of ended with the walking away. I think the first tangible thing is think about how do we start to walk away from our enmeshment with these particular platforms that are healthy for us. And so this can be as simple as do I have to give my time to this thing? Should I give my time elsewhere? To use a very personal anecdote, after these rules changes came out, I had a conversation with my spouse where I was just I know sometimes when we're driving and you're checked out, you're just I have Facebook, I'm scrolling Facebook. I was would you be okay just not considering deactivating it? And it's just yeah, of course. And in doing that, stepping away from it, she realized she was I feel so much better about myself. I'm not engaging in this continuous cycle that doesn't serve me. And so it doesn't mean that you have to fully delete a thing, but it's how do I extract parts of myself is a first step. And then that might also mean if you've, I knew I was going to say the word Fediverse in this talk. But I think this is also being open to what are these new and different models for doing things. They will not be perfect. They will not be easy. But again, I'm going to go back to Judith Butler of all people. But in that same part that I'm quoting from Undoing Gender, she makes the point that to have livable lives means we have to engage in messy, hard stuff of democracy where we will be in contention. We will not get along always. But that engagement is how you get to a livable life. So I think about what are platforms where we're engaging. When I think about some of the most successful spaces, so part of what I've been doing is my second project is thinking about how history can give us examples for this. So this means it's a little wider than trans folks. It's LGBTQ, early developers, folks who are active online, stuff like that. And when I think about the ways in which they talk about the BBSs they ran, they were deeply invested in their community and connected to it. And that was core to how they understood it. BBSs were not commercially successful, but they worked hard to keep them alive and to think of this computer thing as a part of their wider local community and how it could serve the community. So I think we need to think about the same ways, how can we use digital tools as a thing that are connected to our local community and can serve it? And this may be, depending on where you are, is there a local Mastodon server? I know, I said Mastodon. Is there other ways about other possibilities for communication, or is it just also just stepping away? can I do this using this platform? Or, could I just text people, and try to do more in-person things in a way that, again, will feel healthier. So I think there's lots of ways to do it, but that's why I said end with the walking away. And particularly, I think of, sorry, I talk too much. I think of Melas versus N.K. Jemisin, the Black SF author, in her, I think it's the Black Fantasticus collection, has this great story crafted against Melas called The Ones Who Stay. And I think of we walk away from Melas to make the world that Jemisin has talked about, The Ones Who Stay. And part of the difference in The Ones Who Stay is, because Jemisin talked about how in The Ones Who Stay, they're essentially these angel figures who, when you have, standing is like a metaphor for hate speech. They step in and they eliminate it from the world. That she's saying it requires an active vigilance and engagement and commitment. You can't just allow anyone to say anything, but you also can't just walk away from it. If you want it to be the real world, you have to stay and do the hard work. And I think if we want the spaces that work, we have to stay and do the hard work. And sometimes we will not get easy, frictionless experiences. But we will also not have to be afraid that randos can show up in our mentions and call us mentally ill. Because, we have moderators who will ban them. And rules that say that's not allowed because it's ours. So there's lots of different ways, but yeah, the first step is just how can I walk away from some of this, in meaningful ways? Because you might find it's not that bad. You might end up doing a lot of crosswords. That's what my spouse ended up doing. She became obsessed with crosswords.
Yeah. So it's excuse me, it's a very similar question to Chris's, because I was sort of thinking of it. I'm a trans software developer, and I definitely had a lot of sort of dreams of building our own spaces. Your the line from toward the end of your book, which I first read last year, about sort of owning the servers, has definitely sat with me literally since I read it, and I think also connects a lot to another book that came out last year, Catherine Cross's Locked Off. Covers a very similar sort of idea. But I was thinking a similar question to Chris, but less I guess what are the next steps, but what do you see, because that quote is from 2008.
Yeah.
So what has been the hurdle? Can you point to something that clearly has prevented us from owning the servers, from creating our own digital spaces?
We don't have community. I'll say this. I realize I shut my mic. We don't have community infrastructure in the same way that frankly fandom has always had.
Yeah.
This is the thing where I say, I don't really talk about it in this talk. It's a little too complicated for a quick talk, but the community had a huge infrastructure throughout the 90s going to the 2000s that I argue the internet basically bottoms out. It's why am I going to go to a support group once a week when I have stuff on my computer and I don't have to leave my house? And so folks stopped going, so folks stopped supporting it, which means these groups aren't getting money, and they slowly, one by one, just kind of go away. I'm forgetting the name. There's a great book by a political scientist that came out from SUNY Press a couple of years ago. He looks at this, and he counts the numbers, and at some point, new groups for trans folks just stop being founded. Because it's just we can just use the internet. And while it is great, it means there wasn't this existing infrastructure to support it. Instead, the infrastructure we had left was, at least in the United States, the National Center for Transgender Equality, which was a very middle-of-the-road political lobbying group, and that's not doing us any good. I think it's just it wasn't the same infrastructure, so I think it might mean what are new models and what are the things where we make a group, going back to needing to have the social infrastructure to support the building of it. This is why, at the end of the book, I pointed to the co-op model of the cooperative we're all invested in. And so how is it that the problem of course is getting somebody to start it. I say all this shit and and I'm not at the front of the line doing any of it. I recognize that very much about what I'm saying, but I think it's just we didn't have the infrastructure, but at some point we're going to need to start doing it. And I think we even see evidence of recognition of this is that some of the, or I suspect are some of the original founders of Transsexual Menace have restarted Transsexual Menace. because just like we need groups, we didn't have groups, we didn't have anywhere to go. And what we need is that infrastructure to support these larger like energy to direct people toward this instead of just being like, well, we have a hashtag. It's like, great. Does the hashtag get people together to do something? Sometimes, but increasingly not. I hope that's helpful. I feel like I'm just
Yeah, can I quickly just ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
So I guess I'm just like, is it then really like that there needs to be more of a sort of like hybrid model of having in-person community with, say, geographic chapters combined with, you know, digital interfaces in which they can sort of connect and interact?
I leaned toward that, yeah. Like that was sort of how a lot of early bulletin board systems worked because of their technical limitations. They were based in a city.
Yeah.
And so you had a lot of that concentration the same way. We see a contemporary equivalent to, say, I'm based in Spokane, Washington. We have Odyssey Youth Movement, which is an LGBTQ youth drop-in center and sport group, but they also have a Discord server.
Right.
And so this back and forth, these things support each other.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think we should all turn to Discord because they're equally not trustable, but that model of the hybrid, the two things at once, it gives capacity for local organizing, but it also allows for when you can't do that, you're still connected. And you have an investment in each other in a way that if I am talking to rando on the internet, where sometimes that can be hugely meaningful, and sometimes I can just be like, no, we're not going to engage with each other right now. But when this is a thing guys who read BBSs would talk about, I think I talked about this in the book, I know I talked about the next one, is that moderation was different because if you were administering it, and because they would have regular meetups, when something happened on the BBS and you yelled at someone or got a flame war, they could show up and get in your physical face and get in fights with you. And so that changed entirely how folks talk to each other because they weren't just unknowns, they were people you met and knew. So I think that hybrid model gives that sort of connection that you can have digitally, absolutely, but it makes it smaller. And when it's smaller, it's easier to know everyone than to feel like part of a faceless mass.
And there's like higher stakes to the relationships in the community that you're building.
Yeah, the stakes are much bigger than like, well, I guess I have someone to block now.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Right.
I'm Evelyn, and I have 2 points. One is that some not Speranza, but Ask-Lab, who came up with the term archive of our own, also founded a big convention, VividCon, which lasted for 15 years. So that's another point towards this kind of hybrid model of online and offline. And then the other question I had was what role Usenet had in this kind of online space that developed in the 90s, because it's more federated and more distributed, but still more popular than BBS's. And so I was curious about the trans existence on Usenet.
So if you are any at all familiar with Usenet, you're familiar with why I did not put that in this talk, because Usenet is hard and complicated. For folks who are unfamiliar, that's name. I would say, what's your name again? Evelyn. As Evelyn said. It was essentially decentralized and worked on this sort of federated model where everyone kind of agreed to cooperate and pass messages. In practice, it was a lot more complicated, but that was kind of the underlying idea. Trans spaces on Usenet are interesting and contentious, in part because when they are first sort of created, because they are so public, you have a lot of different folks coming in. The very first trans space on Usenet is actually founded in alt.sex.trans. If you know anything about the history of Usenet, alt.sex is essentially the erotica and pornography section of the alt hierarchy. And so in response to that is when they found alt transgendered, because they recognized that .sex is not going to propagate throughout the network because of its association. And then So Support Transgendered is founded a couple years later and goes through the whole approval process of votes and everything. I think as with all Usenet groups, the scale of posters to lurkers who read Usenet was the true in trans groups as well. You had a group of regular people who often didn't like each other and ended up fighting a lot with each other, and then this vast majority of unknowns reading it. Because that's one thing about Usenet, because it was platform agnostic, many different spaces carried it, and you could receive it to like a specific piece of software for it, you could get a new web browser, you could get it via like a CompuServe or an AOL. So you have this vast unknown audience. And so it has these interesting effects. So like within community publications, references to Usenet can be basically summarized as, yeah, it's there and you can get on it, but I don't know why you would. It's full of weird, mean people. Which is to say Usenet is also infamous for flame wars. And so one of the things when I talk about in the book, I specifically talk about in the context of the history of the term cisgender, that in particular, cisgender is popularized in part because one individual who was, we would now probably call them a troll. They're actually Canadian, so fun fact, Canada, you gave us cisgender. They are a Canadian troll, and for years sort of also said that like, they ran a nonprofit out of the Ontario province. But they use this term, and they made a whole FAQ about defining this term. Even though they didn't develop it, they adopted it afterwards. And so I make the argument, like, because it showed up so much, you have this vast audience reading this word and seeing this word, and they're processing it in different ways. And at some point, it kind of escapes Usenet containment and moves to the web, which is how it, so a series of steps, ends up in Julia Serrano's Julia Serrano's whipping girl. And then that's sort of where it enters popular discourse. But yeah, so it's like an interesting space that was very weird and contentious. Often it was where folks who could not gain purchase in mainstream community publications would end up on Usenet because no one could prevent them, because notably Usenet was unmoderated. Moderated Usenet groups were very rare, and they were often incredibly time-consuming to administrate. So almost nobody did it. So I was sort of thinking, it's like, I sometimes, to understand Usenet, I say folks should think of, imagine if, well, I guess actually it still works. I was gonna say pre-Musk Twitter, but they're both the same. There were lots of racists on Usenet too. You take that and put it together with Reddit, and that baby is Usenet, with all of the good parts and all of the bad parts.
Hi, yeah, I'm curious if there are any examples that you're aware of trans people building a P2P internet or trans community.
You mean historically or contemporary?
Both. Or either.
So there are a couple of, there's one specific trans-specific PBS network that's just focused on trans issues, but notably with any of these kind of networks, someone just had to opt to carry it. It wasn't a thing where a lot of the boards were trans-friendly or they were trans-specific, but that wasn't automatically guaranteed. But otherwise, it's just sort of interesting if it was digital, if there was like a person to person, yeah. Not really. It was more often throughout, especially this period of the 90s and 2000s. It was sort of like, we will teach you how to use the computer, but what you're going to be using is a larger corporate service. It was, again, sort of, for lack of a better, aimed at the non-technical individual. And so one of the things notably is the longer you're on the internet, as we move closer to the present, the mass majority of discourse tends to be produced by folks who are younger and younger. So what they're going to is a service. If you see like P2P stuff now, it's more from like artists using that kind of technology. I think of like Cara Eston's work. It's like really interesting stuff with using Telnet. She's got like, I forget what her Telnet scene is called, but it has like, she's a trans creator thinking through some of this stuff where it's using some of this older technology. But otherwise, honestly, not really. It was this thing where it was it's like a history of consumer technology, and so that tends to be folks who are not super technical, or the ways that they're technical are, I'm really good at Excel, you know. Careful.
I'm curious about, basically you're tracing the connection of these two histories as they interact with each other over time. And then at the end of the talk, you kind of go to our very dire contemporary moment. But that also has a history of, and so I'm just curious about the pitfalls, if you will, of visibility and thinking of the scholarship around visibility being a trap, et cetera, and people pointing to 2014 as the trans tipping point for this kind of hate speech, if you will, happening in relationship to trans communities. And you haven't charted that history. I can understand why, but I'm just curious about how that history maps onto what you shared with us today.
No, it absolutely does. I sort of like, I deal with it opaquely in the book, but you're right, I don't really do it in depth. I only sigh because, as oversight as Judith Butler is, that Laverne Cox Time cover, it's like, oh boy, we're gonna talk about that again. But I think this is where we see changing technology as a part of this. We are moving, throughout this book, we're moving to an internet that is increasingly visual. And that visuality increases visibility. And also, notably, as it's more visual, it's also more and more commercial. I think folks have said about other stuff, I think it's true in this history as well. The original sin of the commercial internet is ads. Because ads require tracking. They require knowing that someone is seeing the ad. And so that incentivizes the production of platforms that collect data. And notably, these are also highly visual platforms, so it encourages folks to increase their visibility, to become more visible, but also to be more individuated. This is, I didn't really get into it with homepages, but I like the homepage is a format where you are an individual. It's just you and your homepage. Your photo gallery is just you and all your amazing photos. And depending on your identity and way you present yourself, all the ones you got done at Glamour Shots. Crossdressers love Glamour Shots. But again, they're hyper individual focused, and we sort of continue to think about we're highly visual individuals who all of our access is supported by our ability to see ads. And so these are all systems that want you to be visual, they want you to be looking all the time, they want you to be interacting all the time. And so I think like this idea of trans visibility too, trans folks are interesting, or things people want to look at. And so like it's a part of this arc as well. I think of kind of like particular like media coverage of, to use a different thing I don't want to talk about in this book, vlogs. So the many, many news stories about when folks who were engaging in medical transition, they're like, one photo a day for a year. And so like, listen, we make great clickbait, all right? People love to see transformations. And that's built into, honestly, like medical transition, if that's the thing people want. And so like it encourages people to look, and encourages people to see, and encourages trans people to think of themselves as visual objects to be seen. So I don't really talk about the book, but so like when I did, to give kind of like a personal anecdote of this, like how I think about this visuality. So I started medical transition when I started my MA at the University of Kansas. I also launched into a master's project where I was watching hundreds of vlogs of mostly trans men transition. I do not recommend watching many other people go through the same process, except to be perfectly frank in my brain, they're skinnier and hotter and younger than me. It's not great. It's not great for your mental health. But like, I recognize the way in which I was encouraged to be visual and to consume the visual, and to reflect upon myself in the context of looking at these other people about, why could I not be hot and skinny like them? I'm not. I'm like Midwestern shaped in a rectangle. It's just a fact. But like, so I think of this as like this increasing like visuality encourages us to be visible, and systems we want all humans to think of themselves as more visible. In the case of vloggers, monetizable. And it basically creates this like perfect storm, at which point trans folks are highly visible and put into danger. And I think this is why young trans folks increasingly will just have the Discord to pull away from that visibility, because it's a recognition of a kind of risk there. And so it's like, how can I have a closed space where I can choose to be visible, as opposed to feeling like, if I am not highly visible, then do I even matter?
Any further questions, folks? Don't be shy.
I think we just have one more if that's fine.
Otherwise, I just tell stories.
Fun is fun.
I'm curious if you have any thoughts then about, I think a lot about the fact that as you track in your book,
Mhm.
the internet was a place that allowed trans people and the very sort of like diverse and distinct identities to coalesce and create a unified sort of idea of being transgender. Do you have any thoughts on how the online trans community has sort of moved forward from that point to where now I feel like we exist in a time where there are so many sort of micro trans identities that the internet has sort of allowed to sort of given us the ability to sort of propagate and find other people who feel the exact minuscule individualistic way about trans and like transitioning. Like I find it fascinating that we've gone from being all of these different groups through to coming together and then sort of splitting apart again.
I think this is a good question that fits with what Elspeth was asking. This is where I do the other thing I did as part of my PhD that I don't want to talk about. Well, I'm going to talk about the last chapter is like with tags. I feel like this is it's a system that again encourages hyper individualization. Like this is my word and my name, and I am just like this, and you're often not. Like, and then when you're put in a space where there are differences in terms of identity, it feels like, well, this is not my identity, so now we have to like essentially fight over this space. I think about like these systems that encourage individualization often don't encourage coalition. So I'm going to go in a totally different direction there, but this connects. I think about this in terms of, again, I teach undergrads that come from WGSS. Bernice Johnson Reagan's Coalition Politics, where this is a whole essay she's writing, and she gives it as a speech in 81, I want to say. And her idea is that like a coalition is not a home. A coalition is not comfortable. If a coalition is comfortable, then that means that somehow you are excluding someone else. These are like weird spaces that exist on the side where we come together to work toward a goal. We will not be the same. That you have to have a home somewhere else, and then you come back to coalition to engage in work. And sometimes that coalition means we will not all agree, and sometimes we will make mistakes with each other, but we will figure it out. I think when you are engaging in systems where you are alone by yourself as an individual, engaging in those coalition politics feel hard, because you're like, well, I'm not invested in these people I'm in coalition with. Why do I have to care about what this bro stuff says about this thing when I can just block them? You know, I can sort of isolate down. And I think this is where like a part of that in-person can be important. Because again, like when you have to be in coalition with people you see every day, you learn even if there's difference, we can still work toward a common goal. It doesn't mean you have to always like this person, it doesn't mean you have to agree with this person, but you see the goal in front of you. And you see the person in their whole humanity. So like these like systems that like sort of isolate and have us like essentially slice ourselves into ad-friendly boxes that can be marketed to, they eliminate coalition, because coalition is all about a bunch of messy people coming together saying we have a goal, we gotta go toward it. And that means that sometimes we put our messy parts aside because the larger goal is more important, and then as I support you, you will support me because we're invested in each other's liberation. And I think like this is like these systems isolate us, and that's why like it's if it is a locally grounded community, again, you're connected to those people, you're invested in those people. I like sort of to give an example, I kind of reference it without explaining. Like I did an oral history with a BBS user who was a woman of color from Seattle. It was about a BBS she used in Seattle, and she told this story about how she went to a political rally in Oregon, 4 hours away from Seattle, like drove down with somebody she'd only ever met on the BBS. And her sister was convinced she was going to end up murdered. She's like, you are meeting a stranger from your computer to drive to Oregon. What the fuck are you doing? But she felt completely safe because she felt like she knew them. She was connected. She knew where they lived locally. The sense of them. And then she said, I am in a part of groups for queer women of color in Seattle. She's like on Facebook, and it has her name, it has her photo. Her work is around sexuality and education, so she's some public figure. And she's like, I would never do that with anyone, even though it's like all these legal names and this identifying information. Never meet someone like that from Facebook because there's not this sort of grounded connection and community in the same way. I think again, that's another system that encourages us to think of ourselves as these sort of like public friendly nice ad sliced boxes. And any system that can be fulfilling, you can't slice and dice yourself into little pieces to show to a bunch of other people when your whole self is weird and messy, and you need to feel like you can be your whole self. I promise I will tap something towards. But I was thinking about, so I teach this class on gender media activism, and this is the week my students are looking at feminist scenes from the 90s. And in looking at it, they were so engaged, and they were really like, it excited them. And I asked them, I was like, so would any of you make anything like this now? Like, what's different from between this and the media you make now? And they also looked at each other, and they knew it was different, but they couldn't describe it. And one of them finally was like, I would never say anything like this where someone else could see it. I would be afraid of what they would think. And that's why I think, like, you can't be your whole messy self in a way that builds community when you're afraid of what someone else is going to think. And so, they're making zines so they can be real messy, and like, I'm the only one who sees it. Nobody else is going to see it. But I think like these other formats where it's not as accessible, like that's, all of this is how we build coalition as our whole messy selves.
I just wanted to add to that and say that I think there's also, like, we use different voices, people use different voices online versus away from the keyboard, and I think, like, when you're looking at intersectional perspectives, there's not like a one-to-one path, like it's so particular to each person. It's like, if you are autistic and online, you can be a sort of imagined version of yourself, and then when you're in person and you're not masking, like, that's more visible. Like, there's so many things going on there, and I'm thinking about that because one of your very first slides, when you were like, before you transition publicly or medically or all of the above, you could state what your, at that point, sex was online based on the fact that the person couldn't see you. So there's like such an opportunity for somebody to imagine themselves forward and to also to be the worst version of themselves, to be a troll. Like, and I think there's like such opportunities there, and there's like room for trolls in real spaces and online. Like, there's like the messiness of it. I also feel like online is like a shit show, but also if we like, there could be an opportunity in imagining an online that is deliberately bringing in people who are trolls who could then be allies or something. Like,
No, I think that's true. Actually, it is, I mean, when I think about that, it's one of the things, and this is true for, I think, at least a lot of folks where you're kind of trying to figure out mentality online or part of yourself, is that at some point you want that part of yourself to live other places. Yeah. And so, like, what does it mean to have a space where you could start to step out into that, and it felt safe to do that? And because, like, with that, I think of a story from an oral history I did with Chaz Antonelli, who ran a PBS out of Rochester, New York, Multicom 4. And he tells the story of, because he was like, I was the administrative dictator. But so there was this like regular troll who kept coming in and bothering folks. And folks would try to talk to them and engage with them. It was like, and I was engaging in conversation with this person. And I sort of knew they were trolling, but it kept going. And he's like, the community felt safe because they knew that if it got to be too much, I would protect them. Like, they trusted me to do that. But over time, as this person stayed on, they started to change to the point eventually, shocker, they came out to everyone. But it was having that space where clearly the community felt safe-ish. Again, I'm not talking, I only have Chaz's perspective, but I know they were a tight-knit community, but they clearly felt safe enough that like, if it gets to be too much, he'll be gone. We can ask Chaz and be like, okay, you can't just let this dude like fuck around anymore. And Chaz would listen. It felt like they could trust him. And so it opened up that space for this person to figure it out. And so I think that's all about the fact that they trusted each other. They very much trusted each other. He also tells this great story about them planning a prank on him and giving him special K before he got an award. Where it's he's like, I was high as a kite and afraid somebody was gonna murder me, and I'm on stage. It was at like a public park, so it wasn't like super important. But clearly, like they knew each other and really cared about each other. And they cared about the community. And I think like that, it is that investment that like even if you're letting these people in, it's like, okay, is this a space where we can allow that? How do we allow that? What are the bounds of that? Because often, like when we think of trolling now, there are no bounds. You know, again, any engagement is good engagement. So what is our investment to get rid of these people? There isn't one. This is the thing where, like, sure, it feels good to dunk on idiots on Blue Sky, but at some point, is that making a difference? I mean, once or twice, cool, but you gotta do something else. You know, and yeah, I think like all of this sort of investment in having like again a safe space where you, if you're gonna take your online self, you feel like you can bring it to the offline and have the space to make mistakes and figure it out.
But that's also partly why the right has ballooned so much, is that they welcome people in from various different like inputs of what might bring them adjacent to the right, and they're like, oh, yeah, come in here. Whereas the left is just like put itself into tiny little pieces until you're like, well, I'm an individual, but where's everybody else?
I think it's just like it's easy. I think the thing is like it's easier for those. Now we're veering off into like this is what you can tell I'm not a theorist, but I know there are theorists who talk about this. You're veering into this sort of thing. It's like if it's a group of people who already experience trauma and they're not empowered. It's like how do we trust each other? We have to kind of trust our vulnerability in a world that does not. We know we should not be vulnerable. We know we should not be vulnerable. This is why I said to, I mentioned both Elspeth and Danielle to ask, I mean, you were into it, not to ask to post on social media. I work at a Jesuit Catholic university. I don't know how some of the board of trustees feel about my work. I would like to be invisible to them, but I know some of them do not feel positively about the existence of folks like me. And so like that's, again, one hyper-privileged example. But I think like we all know that, and so that is a part of the thing we bring. But this is why, if we're not doing it on such a mass scale that we feel like I don't know any of these people. When it's smaller and local, like even if we're different, we share enough. When it's too big, it's like I don't know these people. How do I share things with them? This is why I think fandom is able to achieve it because fandom has all these infrastructures by which you can get to know people. You can have a shared thing about which that isn't just your personal identity. And we don't have that anymore. Yep.
Well, this was a fantastic talk and a wonderful discussion. Please join me in thanking our speaker. I also wanted to encourage you to purchase the book and to let you know that there is a discount code. I'm going to read it to you right now. It is NYUAU30, so it's 30% off if you want to buy it. And also we've got a few upcoming events with CDHI I just want to let you know about. On February 11th in our Lightning Love series, we have Teaching with Digital Storytelling on Tuesday, February 11th. And I guess it's full, but there is a wait list, so if you're really keen, go ahead and add yourself to that. We also, on March 3rd, we have another lightning lunch called Old Texts, New Contexts. which is virtual. Registration is on our website. And I'll ask you to save the date for our DH Fest 2025, which is Tuesday, April 8th, 2025, from 12 to 4. We'll have an afternoon of facilitated conversation about the future of DH scholarship at U of T, and we will be celebrating all the fabulousness that has been CDHI over the last 4 years, so information in our newsletter. And Danielle's going to send some feedback over there. Thank you, Danielle, for all your work for our event today, and thank you, Avery. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the wonderful audience. Also, I have free stickers and bookmarks for the Great Digital History Project, so you can come get some free swag. All right.